Welcome to the Using the Whole Whale podcast, where we learn from leaders about new ideas and digital strategies making a difference in the social impact world. This podcast is a proud production of Whole Whale, a B Corp digital agency. Thank you for joining us. Now, let's go learn something. This week on the nonprofit newsfeed, well, all I can say is maybe February is for fraud. We have a number of different fraud in the headline type of articles to cover. Nick, how's it going?
It is going good, George. I'm having a good week. Enjoyed the long weekend. I hope you are as well. But as you alluded to, we want to spend this week talking about fraud because when we were looking through the nonprofit news, the news was all bad. So buckle up. Here we go. It's fun bad. Good news. If you like fraud, because our first story is about the Project Veritas CEO has been ousted by his own board of directors. So James O'Keefe was the founder and CEO of the very conservative organization Project Veritas and has been ousted by the group's board of directors, according to reporting from the Washington Post, Politico, and others. So O'Keefe was ousted on concerns that his antics threatened the organization's IRS 501c3 status, according to a memo released by the board that ousted him. O'Keefe alleges he was unfairly ousted, and it seems that this is kind of playing out in the public like a little power struggle here. Regardless, O'Keefe has been called as cruel by some former employees and has been alleged to spend money in lavish ways, including spending $14,000 on a private chartered flight and upwards of $150,000 for private drivers over the previous 18 months. Why is that a problem? Well, the organization is an IRS 501c3 charity. And that is not a good look to regulators, and it seems that the board picked up on that. Now, Project Veritas is known for its hyper-aggressive sting operation type videos that target almost exclusively progressives and liberals in mainstream organizations, campaigns, advocacy groups, or the media, which also calls into question that 501c3 organizations cannot be engaged in politics. Nevertheless, quite a shakeup for this organization, which does cause stirs in the political world. George, what's your read on our first fraud story of the day?
Powerful reminder that when you are a 501c3, reminder, it doesn't mean you're doing, good net positive things. I do objectively think there's a role for organizations that are trying to do some of that muckraking and like looking under the hood and being like, is this a good organization? Are others doing good? But it's the palpable irony here where they themselves are sort of self-emulating because of the misspend. And it's not, it goes beyond overhead. I think, there's that fine line of saying like, oh, charities that spend on staff and expenses have this overhead myth, which is different than saying they're egregious spending on things that are not directly corollary and can't even be argued corollary to the work that the organization does. And it's it's funny to see this because you're going to see this again and again where, guess what? When you're a public charity, that stuff is trackable. It has to be reported. It's right there. It's right there for the board. And they realize the risk to reputation, which is disproportionately high for nonprofits. You live and die on your reputation. You live and die on showing up in the eyes of potential donors and returning donors saying like, no, we used your funds responsible. Look at what we accomplished. And what we accomplished can't be $100,000 in Uber costs.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a trust issue. It's a public trust issue. I think that that's absolutely correct. And this actually harkens back, I think, some of those internal power dynamics harken back to the NRA, which had really, really complicated internal politics at play, and the organization really took a severe hit in reputation across the board. And quite frankly, is why you haven't heard from them over the past year or so, is because of almost very similar situation, to be honest. So Yeah, definitely a cautionary tale. Again, hyper conservative, very, very controversial organization, sometimes veering into, if not surpassing legality. They've actually been sued for paying for Biden's daughter's stolen diary and then publishing it. Anyway, we won't get into that, but I agree with your assessment there, George. Shall I take us into our next story?
Yeah, what do we got?
All right. This one comes from the Mormon Church of CNBC, as it was reported that the Mormon Church has to pay $5 million to the SEC, or Security and Exchange Commission, for disclosure failures. It turns out that the Mormon Church has a vast portfolio of an investment value which reached $32 billion in 2018. And it seemed that in an effort to kind of shield that from public critique, created all sorts of like shell companies, essentially. They're called clone LLCs. And again, they created 12 of them from 1997 through 2019 to kind of shield some of the vast investment holdings from public view. But now they're getting slapped with a pretty hefty fine there. Again, not in the billions, but a 5 million settlement to the SEC. So again, an example of an organization not doing its due diligence with reporting and disclosing, in this case, vast sums of money that they were maneuvering through uh, LLCs to kind of mask their investment portfolio.
$5 million is not even a slap on the wrist. I think if you look at $32 billion of funds under assets that are essentially like looking at a 501c3 nonprofit as actually like that's, I'm pretty sure, a hedge fund. It's larger than most hedge funds. And, we see this also in the medical health industry where, yeah, there's a 501c at the front door, but I think you'd be hard pressed to look behind and see something that looks any different than like a hedge fund and massive investment portfolio. I think there may be cause for a larger conversation about at what point is this no longer for the public benefit when you are effectively, again, an investment vehicle, right? Why do you get to have tax deductions for your return on capital when you just roll that back into a larger portfolio? I think there's a line here also. I just draw that line between an endowment that's being paid off, paid down for the public benefit and being put out there. Yes, the Church of Latter-day Saints can certainly have that argument, but I think there's a point at which that just turns into a front door that gives you tax deductions and a hedge fund, right? And I would say you cross that easily at the $32 billion range. Whether or not that can ever be legislated is another question, but it's, I was shocked actually at that number.
Yeah, that's quite a hefty number they got there. That's quite a chunk of change. That would that would go to a nice apartment here in the city. Um, no, I think you bring up some really good points there, and again, a $5 million fine is nothing compared to that investment portfolio. So it does bring up kind of do the ramifications for things like this actually match something that is poses real consequence for organizations that don't do their due
Yeah, and
diligence.
underlying this, right, this article is talking about how they sort of have acknowledged the SEC that they use these clone LLCs from 1997 to 2019, roughly 12 to 13 of them, and it hid the size of their equity portfolio. Like, question, if you feel like you're doing something above board, question in the front row, why hide them in LLCs? So clearly, hopefully, leads to further examination of the tactics of these portfolio based nonprofits.
Absolutely. I concur. And Moving along, this one comes from the Wall Street Journal, and the title of this is Former FTX Executives Charity Generated Profits from Employee Token Prices. Going back to FTX, of course, founder Sam Bankman Fried was a proponent of the effective altruism movement. And unfortunately, there was a lot of overlap between FTX and charitable and philanthropic causes. And it appears that an executive of FTX generated profits via these tokens that appreciated in value, and they were employee tokens. And within the vehicle of a charity, I'll be honest, George, this is all very above my head. So I'm just gonna turn it to you. What lesson do we need to take from this?
Yeah, these tokens, right, that can be generated out of thin air, and the FTT tokens that FTX, lived and died on, more died, I think, on that front. We talked about effective altruism and how the ends justify the means in that narrative, where maybe fraud goes above and beyond, but the narrative that Sam Bankman-Fried could have been telling himself in his head is that this is all justified because I'm going to give it all away in the end. However, the end happened much sooner, and actually, any of what we're seeing, the charitable efforts along the way, have tremendous problems with them, and there are, just story after story. In this case, we're seeing how this, charity was given these tokens, which probably had some question marks on them because those tokens weren't worth anything because they were effectively unbacked securities. So, another 150 million trying to cash out of its frozen FTX account, will probably not be able to go ahead. And there's a lot of, I think, nonprofits and great causes that maybe expected significant paydays and instead are getting probably more headaches and hopefully not risk of infrastructural collapse, because if they hired against this or they did certain actions against this or didn't go after other donors as a net result, worse than effective altruism, it's destructive altruism. It's actually hurting almost every organization that they potentially talk to because of what it meant for them. And this is just a sort of a callback to that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The fallout from this whole saga has been very broad, touched a lot of organizations in the charitable sector, especially. So I think you bring up some good points. I am going to take us into our next story now, and this one comes from Forbes. And the essence of this story is that the Medical Cost Sharing Ministry, or MCS, is a Christian ministry offering an Obamacare alternative, but has been accused of $4 million in fraud by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, allegedly denying coverage to hundreds of clients who had medical bills they thought would be covered in return for monthly contributions, which were not. The feds claim that the business owners, Craig Reynolds and James McGinnis, pocketed $4 million of the $7.5 million in membership payments, with only $250K actually going to the medical expenses. The organization has not distributed any money to any members since 2021. And the article goes on to talk about victims of the alleged fraud being two pregnant women and others. A heart attack sufferer, a woman who had to be airlifted to the hospital. And these folks were left with thousands in unpaid medical bills. And MCS, this organization, essentially refused to covering the cost and was pocketed. So this sucks.
Oh, I don't mean to laugh. I was just waiting for a more nuanced take. Yeah, the brutal truth is that when you mix faith and Christianity with corrupt individuals, and they can then leverage that and use narratives like, "Look how bad Obamacare is. Let's create a separate insurance company. Trust us. Trust God. You pay us, and we'll definitely be there for you." Is called an unregulated insurance market. And I think any claims of this, right, where you're effectively offering insurance or any type of protection like this should be treated like that. You're no longer, a nonprofit. You are operating and making a promise to people giving you money that falls under real commercial liability and security liability. And I think any much more scrutiny. I think this is just one of maybe many. It was a big number, but this is incredibly depressing because you're just taking advantage of people's faith for profit. Makes me a little sick. In your words, right?
Yeah, no, it's a little sickening. But yeah, you bring up some good points that are worth highlighting. And just it's always terrible when folks are taken advantage of in such
Man, this is a
egregious
real fraud
ways.
lineup.
So
I mean, this is, I think,
something
why
we
we
keep
call
an
it
eye out
February's for
for.
fraud.
Absolutely. All right, I'll take us to our next story. And this one involves, interestingly, Sean Penn. So Sean Penn's charity Core has become a money mess, according to Bloomberg.com. Sean Penn hosted a party at Soho Beach House for an Art Basel event and raised 1.6 million for his nonprofit Core Response, with money earmarked for COVID relief efforts in Latin America. And the fundraiser was a victory for Core Response. And it raised close to $200 million, putting 3,000 plus people on its payroll. The money would go to Brazil, the only place in the region where Core had any notable COVID relief programs. However, Core Response has struggled to find new footing after winding down its ground level staffing in Los Angeles and other U.S. cities when the Delta variant ebbed. So it seems that the story here is a lot of money very quickly and complicated management of said money once the mission changes and COVID evolves. George, what's your take?
I just wanted to make sure we did bring this up. It was, brought up, I think, earlier in February, and it's kind of been in the background as we've been sort of watching to see if any other details came of light. But if you raise money for a cause, make sure you can track it to that cause. I think Sean Penn does, a lot of interesting work in the field of philanthropy, but it's also important to investigate the narratives, the authenticity, and where the money goes, and not just sort of, fall under the spell of brand of celebrity. I tend to be more skeptical when I see a celebrity first initiative rather than a cause first.
Yeah, I think that's a good and important point there. Definitely something to think about, especially as we talk about, celebrity endorsed causes and nonprofits. And, takes us even back to our Sam Bankman-Fried article. But I think you raise a lot of points that are important to remember. And this story kind of pulls the thread on those a little bit. But I can take us into our feel-good story. And this feel-good story comes from USA Today, and it is about a nonprofit organization called Achieve Tahoe that has made skiing adaptive and accessible for disabled people or people with disabilities. So this organization out in Tahoe, which I know is a place near and dear to some of my coworkers, including you, George, is helping kids and others with disabilities access adventure, outdoors type activities like skiing, which is always awesome. Like, it's so cool when something, I guess, kind of as physically intense as skiing is accessible to folks. It's just an awesome story. Great work from Achieve Tahoe, and just in a day of fraud, I think a really awesome way to highlight an organization doing good work. We needed a feel-good story after the end of today.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I'm lucky enough to be up in Tahoe and saw that story. It made me smile. Finally, I have to ask you a question, Nick. Why don't donors trust ladder up messages? Wait for it. It's because they're always up to something. Yep, that's what I'll leave you with. All right. Thanks. See you out there. This has been Using the Whole Whale podcast. If you want to keep learning more about these topics and others, head on over to wholewhale.com/university to keep learning with us. Thanks as always to GregThomasMusic.org for his tunes that underwrite our tracks. They're fantastic. Hope you're doing well, Greg. And just a reminder, subscribes really help us on any platform that you listen to us on. Please give a thought to click and subscribe, and maybe even a comment, because we like hearing from you.